The morning air at Fort Bragg hung thick with humidity as Sergeant First Class Kira Devane stepped off the transport bus, her duffel bag slung over one shoulder with an ease that spoke of countless similar arrivals. She was 32, but could have passed for younger, with a slender frame that contradicted the weight of the gear she carried. Her dark hair was pulled back in a regulation bun, and her eyes, a striking amber color, took in the training compound with the kind of quiet assessment that most people mistook for nervousness. The Advanced Infantry Training Unit sprawled before her, a collection of aging buildings and obstacle courses that had seen decades of soldiers pass through. This was her new assignment, a dramatic shift from the last 8 years of her career, though no one here would know the details of those years. That information lived in classified files accessible only to those with the highest clearances. Staff Sergeant Vincent Rourke spotted her first, his barrel chest straining against his uniform as he approached with the swagger of someone who had spent the last 5 years molding recruits. He looked her up and down with barely concealed skepticism, his thick eyebrows drawing together. "You Devane?" he asked, though he was already glancing at the roster on his clipboard. "Yes, Staff Sergeant," she replied, her voice steady but soft, almost musical in its quietness. Rourke's expression soured slightly. He had been expecting someone different, someone who looked like they had seen combat, someone with the hard edges and visible scars that he associated with real soldiers. This woman before him seemed too delicate, too composed, too quiet. "Welcome to AITU," he said without warmth. "We're on a tight ship here. I hope you're ready to actually work for a living instead of whatever desk job you've been warming." Kira simply nodded, offering no defense, no explanation. She had learned long ago that some truths were better left unspoken, especially when they were wrapped in classifications that could end careers if violated. Before we continue, I want to take a moment to connect with all of you watching. Drop a comment and let us know what state you're watching from. Maybe you've witnessed similar quiet strength in someone from your community, someone who carried more than anyone realized. The barracks she was assigned to housed 6 other instructors, all male, all veterans of various conflicts, and all seemingly cut from the same cloth of loud confidence and competitive bravado. Master Sergeant Tyrell Voss was the first to greet her as she set her gear on the empty bunk near the door. "Fresh meat," Voss announced to the room, his voice booming off the concrete walls. "What did you do to get stuck here, sweetheart? Fail out of admin school?" The others laughed, a chorus of masculine amusement that filled the space. Kira methodically began unpacking, her movements efficient and practiced, giving no indication that the comment had landed. "She's awful quiet," observed Sergeant First Class Ramon Oakes from his bunk across the room. He was cleaning his rifle with exaggerated care, his muscular arms working the cloth along the barrel. "Cat got your tongue, Devane. Just focus on getting settled," she replied evenly, not looking up from her task. The truth was that Kira had spent the better part of the last 8 years in places these men had only heard about in classified briefings. She had operated in the shadows of 3 different countries, her presence so compartmentalized that even her own chain of command had been fragmented by need-to-know restrictions. Her quiet nature was not a weakness, but a survival skill honed in environments where a single wrong word could compromise an entire operation. Lieutenant Brennan Cross entered the barracks then, his presence immediately commanding attention. He was young for his rank, barely 30, with the kind of polished appearance that suggested a career built more on connections than combat experience. His eyes swept the room and landed on Kira with obvious disappointment. "Sergeant Devane," he said, his tone formal but cold. "I reviewed your file. Looks like you've been with support units mostly. This is a combat training facility. We need instructors who have actually been in the fight, not behind a desk. I trust you'll be able to keep up." Kira met his gaze directly, her amber eyes steady and unreadable. "I'll do my job, sir," she said simply. Cross seemed annoyed by her lack of elaboration, by her refusal to justify herself or explain. He wanted a reaction, some sign of defensiveness or eagerness to prove herself. Instead, he got only calm acceptance. "See that you do," he said curtly before leaving the barracks. As the door closed behind him, Voss let out a low whistle. Ice cold. That one, he said, gesturing toward Kira with his thumb. But she hasn't fired a rifle in anger once in her career. The assumption settled over the room like dust, unchallenged and accepted as fact. Kira continued unpacking, her hand steady, her expression unchanged. She had heard worse, endured worse, survived worse. These words were nothing compared to the weight of the secrets she carried. The first week at the Advanced Infantry Training Unit passed in a blur of skepticism and barely concealed contempt. Kira found herself assigned to the most basic training modules, teaching new recruits how to properly clean their weapons and maintain their gear. It was work that any private could have done, and the message was clear. Lieutenant Cross did not trust her with anything more substantial. During morning formation on her 6th day, Staff Sergeant Rourke announced the training schedule with his usual bombastic energy. His voice carried across the assembled instructors and recruits like a bullhorn. Today we're running live fire exercises on Range 7, he barked. Devane, you'll be on safety duty. Stand behind the line and make sure nobody does anything stupid. Several of the male instructors exchanged knowing glances. Safety duty was the assignment given to instructors who were not trusted to actually teach marksmanship. It was a glorified babysitting position. Kira nodded once, her face betraying nothing. She had qualified expert marksmen on every weapon system the Army had offered her, including several that did not officially exist in any public records. She had made shots at distances and under conditions that would have seemed impossible to most of the men standing around her. But none of that mattered here, not when her actual service record was locked behind classifications that she could not discuss. At the range, Private Elias Crane struggled with his rifle, his hands shaking as he tried to acquire his target. He was 19, fresh out of basic training, and visibly anxious. After his 3rd shot went wide, missing the target entirely, he slumped in frustration. I can't do this, he muttered, loud enough for those nearby to hear. Sergeant First Class Oakes, who was supposed to be instructing the group, was too busy talking with another instructor about weekend plans. He had barely glanced at the recruits since they had begun firing. Kira moved quietly to Crane's position, crouching beside him. Her voice was low, meant only for him. Your breathing is off, she said simply. You're anticipating the recoil. Exhale slowly, squeeze between heartbeats, don't pull. Crane looked at her with surprise, then skepticism. You've done this before? He asked, doubt evident in his tone. A few times, she replied, the understatement so massive it was almost absurd. He followed her advice, adjusting his stance as she made minute corrections to his grip. His next shot hit center mass on the target. Then the next. Then the next. 5 rounds, all grouped tightly in the kill zone. How'd you do that? Crane asked, genuine wonder in his voice. Before Kira could respond, Oakes noticed the exchange and strode over, his face flushed with irritation. Devane, you're on safety, not instruction, he snapped. Stay in your lane. She stood, stepping back without argument. But Crane was looking at her differently now, like he had glimpsed something beneath the surface that did not match the narrative everyone else seemed to accept. That evening in the instructor barracks, Master Sergeant Voss was holding court, regaling the others with a story from his deployment to Afghanistan. He described a firefight with exaggerated hand gestures, his voice rising and falling with dramatic flair. The others listened with varying degrees of interest, some having heard the story multiple times before. Kira sat on her bunk, reading a worn paperback novel, her posture relaxed but her attention divided. She heard everything, processed everything, filed it all away with the kind of situational awareness that had kept her alive in far more dangerous circumstances. What about you, Devane? Voss said suddenly, directing the group's attention toward her. You got any war stories? Or is your most intense combat experience a paper cut from filing reports? The barracks erupted in laughter. Kira looked up from her book, her amber eyes meeting Voss's gaze with that same unreadable calm. Nothing worth mentioning, she said quietly, returning to her reading. The dismissal seemed to annoy Voss more than any defensive response would have. He wanted a reaction, wanted her to either puff up with false bravado or shrink with embarrassment. Her complete neutrality left him nowhere to push. Lieutenant Cross entered then, his uniform crisp despite the late hour. He carried a clipboard and wore an expression of bureaucratic annoyance. "Devane," he said without preamble, "Division is sending a colonel for inspection next week. He'll be reviewing instructor qualifications and training protocols. I need you to compile all the safety reports and training documentation. Should be right up your alley." It was another menial task, more administrative work, to keep her away from actual instruction. Kira simply nodded. "Yes, sir," she replied. Cross left without further comment, and the atmosphere in the barracks shifted slightly. The mention of a colonel's visit had introduced a new tension, a reminder that their comfortable routines might face scrutiny. "A colonel," Rourke said, shaking his head. "That means dog and pony show time. Everyone better have their act together." Kira returned to her book, but her mind was already working through the implications. Colonels with enough rank to conduct division-level inspections often had access to higher classification levels. They could see things that lieutenants and sergeants could not. The thought settled in her chest with a weight that was both familiar and unsettling. Private Crane appeared at the barracks door then, technically against protocol, but Rourke was too distracted to care. "Sergeant Devane?" Crane said hesitantly. "I just wanted to say thank you for the help today. Made a huge difference." "Just doing my job, Private," Kira replied, not looking up from her book. But Crane lingered, as if he wanted to say more, as if he sensed that there was a story here that no one was telling. Finally, he nodded and left, leaving behind questions that hung in the air like smoke. The week ahead would bring changes, Kira knew. The colonel's visit would shift dynamics in ways that no one in this barracks could anticipate. She turned the page of her book and continued reading, her expression unchanged, her secrets still safely locked away. The second week brought an unexpected complication that would test the carefully maintained distance Kira had established between herself and the rest of the unit. During a routine combat training exercise in the dense pine forest surrounding the base, one of the recruits made a critical error that sent the entire scenario spiraling toward disaster. Specialist Marcus Tyndall, a 23-year-old with more confidence than common sense, had been designated as point man for his squad's patrol exercise. The instructors, including Kira, were shadowing the group from a distance, observing and taking notes on performance. Staff Sergeant Rourke was lead evaluator, his attention focused on his clipboard more than the actual movements of the troops. Tyndall pushed his squad too far forward, ignoring the terrain features that should have signaled caution. Kira noticed it immediately, the way the ground sloped unnaturally, the disturbed earth that indicated recent activity. Her instincts, honed through countless real operations, screamed warnings that had nothing to do with this training exercise. She moved forward quietly, intending to signal Rourke, but he waved her off dismissively without even looking up from his notes. "Let them learn through mistakes, Devane," he said curtly. "That's how real soldiers are made." But this was not a mistake that should be learned through experience. The area Tyndall was leading his squad into had been used for demolition training the previous week, and while it should have been cleared, Kira's eyes caught something that made her blood run cold. A small section of tripwire, barely visible in the underbrush, connected to what looked like a training mine that had not been properly deactivated. She did not wait for permission. Her body moved with a fluidity and speed that shocked everyone watching. She crossed 30 yards in seconds, her hand shooting out to grab Tyndall's shoulder and yanking him backward with enough force to send him stumbling. The squad froze, confused and startled. "Nobody move," Kira said, her voice still quiet but now carrying an undeniable authority that cut through the confusion. Her eyes scanned the ground with practiced precision. "Stay exactly where you are." Rourke came crashing through the brush, his face red with anger. "What the hell do you think you're doing, Devane? You just compromised the entire exercise." Kira did not look at him. She was already on one knee, examining the tripwire and the device it was connected to. Her hands moved with careful expertise, tracing the mechanism with the kind of knowledge that came from disarming far more sophisticated devices in far more dangerous circumstances. "This is live," she said simply. "Training mine with a faulty deactivation. Wire still hot." The color drained from Rourke's face. He moved closer, saw what she was seeing, and his entire demeanor changed in an instant. He keyed his radio with shaking hands. "All units, this is Rourke. We have a possible live ordnance situation in Sector 4. Clear the area. I need EOD out here now." Kira was already working, her movements precise and unhurried despite the danger. She had done this before, many times, in places where calling for backup was not an option. Her fingers worked the mechanism with the kind of confidence that only came from extensive experience. "Devane, wait for EOD," Rourke said, but his voice lacked conviction. He could see that she knew what she was doing, that her hands moved with professional certainty. "It will be safe in 30 seconds, or it will detonate in the next 2 minutes when the pressure shift triggers the failsafe," Kira replied, her voice maddeningly calm. "Your choice, Staff Sergeant." The recruits watched in frozen silence as her hands continued to work. Tyndall, still standing where she had pulled him, looked like he might be sick. 30 seconds felt like 30 hours as Kira carefully disconnected the mechanism, her breathing steady and controlled. Finally, she lifted the deactivated device and stood, holding it away from her body. "It is safe now," she said quietly. The explosive ordnance disposal team arrived 10 minutes later, their truck kicking up dust as it skidded to a halt. Chief Warrant Officer Helena Vestra climbed out, her weathered face set in professional concern. She took the device from Kira, examined it with expert eyes, and let out a low whistle. "Clean disarm," Vestra said, looking at Kira with newfound respect. "Where did you learn to work ordnance like this?" "Here and there," Kira replied, offering nothing more. Vestra studied her for a long moment, clearly wanting to ask more questions, but recognizing the wall that Kira had erected. She nodded slowly and returned to her team to properly dispose of the training mine. Back at the compound, word spread quickly about what had happened. The story morphed and twisted with each retelling, but the core remained the same. The quiet instructor that everyone had dismissed had just saved multiple lives with skills that nobody knew she possessed. In the instructor barracks that evening, the atmosphere was different. Not warm, but no longer openly contemptuous. Sergeant First Class Oak sat on his bunk, cleaning his rifle and occasionally glancing at Kira with something that might have been grudging curiosity. "That was some quick thinking out there," he said finally, the words seeming to cost him something to speak. Kira looked up from the training reports she was compiling for the colonel's upcoming inspection. "Just doing my job," she replied. Master Sergeant Voss, however, was less willing to adjust his assessment. "Probably just got lucky," he muttered. "Right place, right time. Any of us would have done the same thing. But they would not have, and everyone in the room knew it. They would not have seen the danger, would not have known how to disarm the device, would not have moved with that kind of practice precision. The gap between what they believed about Kira and who she actually was had begun to show cracks, small fissures in the narrative they had constructed. Private Crane appeared at the door again, this time with several other recruits behind him. They looked at Kira with expressions that mixed gratitude and awe. "Sergeant Devane," Crane said, "we just wanted to say thank you. You saved our lives today." Kira nodded once, uncomfortable with the attention. "Stay alert out there," she said, "and trust your instincts." As the recruits left, Lieutenant Cross emerged from his office, having heard about the incident through official channels. He stood in the doorway of the barracks, his jaw tight, clearly struggling with something. Finally, he spoke. "Good work today, Devane," he said stiffly. "But in the future, follow the chain of command before taking action." It was a face-saving statement, an attempt to reassert authority that had been undermined by her competence. Kira simply nodded, giving him the response he needed without argument or pride. But something had shifted, and everyone could feel it. The colonel's inspection was now just days away, and the questions about Sergeant First Class Kira Devane were beginning to multiply. The morning of the colonel's inspection arrived with unseasonable heat that left the entire base feeling sluggish and irritable. Kira had been awake since 4, reviewing the compiled documentation that Lieutenant Cross had assigned her to prepare. Every training report, safety protocol, and instructor qualification was organized with meticulous precision in 3 thick binders that now sat on Cross's desk. The colonel was expected at 0800 hours, and the entire advanced infantry training unit had been scrubbed and polished to an almost absurd degree. Instructors stood in formation wearing their dress uniforms, the morning sun glinting off polished buttons and badges. Kira stood in the back row, her posture perfect but unremarkable, just another face among many. The black SUV arrived precisely on time, and Colonel Theodore Ashford stepped out with the bearing of a man who had spent 30 years earning every piece of metal on his chest. He was in his early 50s, with steel gray hair cut high and tight, and eyes that missed nothing. His uniform displayed tabs and badges that spoke of Ranger School, airborne qualification, and multiple combat deployments. This was not a desk officer playing at leadership. Lieutenant Cross snapped the formation to attention and delivered a crisp salute that Ashford returned with practiced efficiency. The colonel's eyes swept across the assembled instructors with the kind of assessment that went beyond surface appearances. He was reading them, evaluating not just their uniforms but their character, their competence, their worth. At ease, Ashford said, his voice carrying authority without needing volume. I am here to conduct a comprehensive review of training protocols and instructor qualifications. I will be examining your methods, your results, and your personnel files. This is not a social visit. The formation was dismissed, and Ashford followed Cross into the command building. Staff Sergeant Rourke had been designated as the primary liaison for the inspection, which meant spending the day walking the colonel through various facilities and training areas. Master Sergeant Voss and Sergeant First Class Oakes were assigned to accompany them, leaving Kira to manage the day's training schedule with the junior instructors. She moved through the morning's rifle qualification exercises with her usual quiet efficiency, correcting stances and offering guidance in that soft voice that recruits had learned carried more wisdom than the louder instructors who preceded her. Private Crane had become something of an informal assistant, anticipating what she needed before she asked and watching her with the kind of attention that suggested he was trying to solve a puzzle. Sergeant Devane, Crane said during a break between firing rotations. Can I ask you something? Kira glanced at him, her amber eyes neutral. You can ask. What did you serve before here? I have been looking through the public rosters, and your name does not appear in any of the usual deployment lists. That would be because my deployments were not on public rosters, private, she replied simply. Some assignments are classified. Crane nodded slowly, processing this. Like Special Operations Classified? Kira did not answer, which was itself an answer. She turned her attention back to the range, watching a recruit struggle with her breathing technique. Meanwhile, in the command building, Colonel Ashford was systematically dismantling the comfortable assumptions that had governed the training unit for years. He sat in Lieutenant Cross's office, the 3 binders Kira had prepared spread before him, and his expression grew increasingly stern as he read through incident reports and training outcomes. Your injury rate is higher than division average, Ashford observed, his finger tapping a particular page. Your qualification pass rates are lower. Your instructor retention is abysmal. Lieutenant Cross, explain to me why I should not recommend a complete overhaul of this unit's leadership. Cross shifted uncomfortably, his carefully constructed confidence crumbling under scrutiny. Sir, we maintain rigorous standards. Perhaps the metrics do not reflect the quality of soldiers we are producing. Ashford's eyes narrowed. Metrics are how we measure effectiveness, Lieutenant. If your metrics are poor, your effectiveness is poor. Who compiled these reports? Sergeant First Class Devane, sir, Cross replied, a hint of dismissiveness entering his tone. She handles most of our administrative work. Devane, Ashford repeated, his eyes scanning the name on the documentation. The precision of the reports had already caught his attention. They were not just thorough, but demonstrated an understanding of training methodology that exceeded what he would expect from a typical instructor. Where is Sergeant Devane now? Running today's qualification exercises, sir, Rourke interjected. She's on safety duty mostly. Good with paperwork, but not much combat experience. Ashford looked up sharply. Not much combat experience? What makes you say that? Rourke exchanged glances with Voss and Oakes, their uncertainty suddenly visible. Well, sir, she is very quiet. Reserved. Does not really talk about her service. Her file shows mostly support unit assignments. Show me her file, Ashford ordered, his tone leaving no room for debate. Cross pulled the personnel file from his cabinet and handed it to the colonel. Ashford opened it and began reading, his expression shifting from interest to intense focus. He turned pages slowly, his jaw tightening with each new section. Finally, he looked up at the three men before him. This file is incomplete, he said flatly. Where's the rest of it? That is everything we have access to, sir, Cross replied, confusion evident in his voice. Ashford pulled out his phone and made a call, speaking in terse sentences that the others could not fully hear. He referenced authorization codes and classification levels that were far above anything typically needed for a training unit inspection. The conversation lasted 5 minutes, and when he ended the call, his expression had transformed into something between anger and disbelief. Gentlemen, he said slowly, each word measured and deliberate. Do any of you have the faintest idea who Sergeant First Class Kira Devane actually is? The three men looked at each other, their confusion deepening. She is an instructor, sir, Cross said weakly. Administrative support primarily. Ashford stood, his full height and bearing suddenly filling the small office with an almost physical presence. She is considerably more than that, Lieutenant. Considerably more. I want her brought here immediately. And I want every instructor in this unit assembled in the main briefing room in 30 minutes. Yes, sir, Cross said, snapping to attention, though his mind was racing with questions he did not dare ask. Ashford returned to the personnel file before him, reading sections that had just been transmitted to his secure phone. His lips formed a thin line as he absorbed information that painted a picture radically different from the narrative that had dominated this training unit. The quiet woman they had dismissed, the instructor they had relegated to menial tasks, the soldier they had mocked for her reserved nature, was something else entirely. And in 30 minutes, everyone was going to learn exactly what that was. Private Crane found Kira at the far end of the rifle range, where she was helping a struggling recruit adjust her grip. The young private approached with obvious urgency, snapping to attention when she turned to face him. Sergeant Devane, the colonel wants to see you immediately in the command building, Crane said, his voice tight with something that might have been concern. All instructors are being called to the main briefing room. Kira's expression did not change, but something shifted behind her amber eyes. A calculation, a recognition of what was about to unfold. She nodded once and handed her clipboard to Crane. Continue the rotation, she said simply. Standard protocol. The walk to the command building felt longer than usual, though it was the same quarter-mile she had traversed dozens of times over the past 2 weeks. The heat had intensified, making the air shimmer above the asphalt, but Kira moved with her characteristic unhurried pace. She knew what was coming. She had known since the moment Lieutenant Cross mentioned a colonel's inspection. Officers at that level had access to files that others could not see, to truths that had been deliberately obscured for operational security. The briefing room was already filling when she arrived. Staff Sergeant Rourke stood near the front, his usual swagger diminished by obvious nervousness. Master Sergeant Voss and Sergeant First Class Oakes were whispering to each other, speculation written across their faces. Lieutenant Cross stood rigid near the podium, his jaw clenched so tight it looked painful. Other instructors filed in, their confusion palpable. No one understood why they had been summoned, but the tension in the room suggested it was significant. Kira entered quietly, taking a position near the back wall. Several instructors glanced at her, and she caught fragments of whispered speculation. Some thought she had done something wrong, that the colonel had found fault with her documentation. Others wondered if this was about the ordnance incident from the previous week. None of them came close to the actual truth. Colonel Ashford entered through the side door, his presence immediately commanding total silence. He carried a folder stamped with classification markings that most of the people in the room had never seen before. His eyes swept across the assembled instructors with an intensity that made several of them shift uncomfortably. "Be seated," Ashford ordered, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. The instructors sat, the scrape of chairs against linoleum the only sound. Kira remained standing against the back wall, her posture relaxed but attentive. Ashford's eyes found her immediately, and something passed between them. Not quite recognition, but acknowledgement. He knew what she was. She knew that he knew. "I have spent the morning reviewing this unit's performance metrics, training protocols, and personnel files," Ashford began, his tone formal and severe. "What I have found is deeply troubling. Your injury rates are unacceptable. Your qualification pass rates are below standard. Your leadership has failed to maximize the resources available to this unit." Lieutenant Cross's face flushed red, but he remained silent. Rourke stared at his hands. The other instructors exchanged uncomfortable glances. However, Ashford continued, his voice taking on a different edge. "The most troubling discovery I made today was not about your failures. It was about your complete and utter ignorance regarding one of your own instructors." The confusion in the room deepened. Several instructors looked around, trying to determine who the colonel was referencing. Ashford opened the classified folder and pulled out a single sheet of paper. "Sergeant First Class Kira Devane," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. "Please step forward." Kira moved from her position against the wall, her steps measured and quiet. She stopped in front of the colonel and came to attention with military precision. The room was utterly silent now, every eye fixed on her slender frame, trying to understand what was happening. Ashford looked at the assembled instructors, his expression a mixture of anger and disappointment. For the past 2 weeks, this soldier has been assigned to safety duty and administrative tasks. She has been relegated to the most basic instructor responsibilities because her chain of command assumed she lacked combat experience. He paused, letting the weight of those words settle. That assumption could not be more catastrophically wrong. Staff Sergeant Rourke's eyes widened. Master Sergeant Voss leaned forward, his earlier dismissiveness evaporating. Lieutenant Cross looked like he might be physically ill. Sergeant Devane's actual service record is classified at a level that requires special authorization to access, Ashford continued. "What I can tell you is limited, but what I can tell you should fundamentally change how you view this soldier and your own competence as leaders." He glanced down at the document in his hands, then back at the assembled instructors. "Sergeant Devane has completed 4 combat deployments to classified locations conducting classified operations. She holds expert qualifications in 12 different weapons systems, including several that do not exist in any public inventory. She is certified in advanced demolitions, counterterrorism operations, and tactical intelligence gathering." The room seemed to tilt. Oakes was staring at Kira with his mouth slightly open. Voss had gone pale. Rourke looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. Ashford was not finished. During her most recent deployment, which ended 4 months ago, Sergeant Devane was part of a special operations task force conducting high-value target elimination in an extremely hostile environment. He paused, his eyes moving across the stunned faces before him. "Her confirmed kill count, gentlemen, is 63 enemy combatants." The number hung in the air like a physical thing. 63. It was a number that most infantry soldiers never approached in entire careers. It was a number that spoke of sustained combat operations at the highest levels of intensity and danger. And it belonged to the quiet woman standing at attention in front of them, the instructor they had mocked, dismissed, and underestimated at every turn. She has been awarded 2 silver stars for Bronze Stars with Valor and a Purple Heart, Ashford continued. All of these citations remain classified and do not appear in her public record. She has trained with special operations units from 4 different countries and has been personally commended by 3 separate theater commanders. Lieutenant Cross looked like he was having difficulty breathing. His carefully constructed authority, his dismissive treatment of Kira, his decision to relegate her to menial tasks. All of it was crashing down around him with devastating clarity. "And you assigned her to safety duty," Ashford said, his voice dropping to something quiet and dangerous. "You took one of the most highly trained combat soldiers in this entire division and had her stand behind a line watching recruits clean their rifles." The colonel turned to face Kira directly, and his expression softened almost imperceptibly. "Sergeant Devane, at ease." Kira relaxed her stance slightly, her face still betraying nothing. But there was something in her eyes now, a flicker of acknowledgement that the mask she had worn for 2 weeks was no longer necessary. Ashford addressed the room one final time. "This unit will undergo immediate restructuring. Sergeant Devane will be reassigned to lead all advanced combat training programs. Lieutenant Cross, you will report to division headquarters tomorrow morning for reassignment counseling. The rest of you will spend the next month learning from someone who actually knows what combat looks like." The briefing room remained frozen in stunned silence as the weight of revelation settled over everyone present. The quiet instructor, the woman they had overlooked, the soldier they had dismissed, was something none of them had imagined. And now, everything was about to change. The silence that followed Colonel Ashford's revelation stretched for what felt like an eternity. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The instructors sat frozen in their chairs, their minds struggling to reconcile the quiet woman standing before them with the warrior the colonel had just described. 63 confirmed kills. Silver stars. Classified operations. The words did not seem to fit the slender figure with amber eyes who had spent 2 weeks being dismissed and mocked. Finally, Master Sergeant Voss found his voice, though it came out hoarse and uncertain. "Sir, I do not understand. Why was this information not in her standard personnel file? Why were we not informed?" Ashford turned his cold gaze on Voss, and the sergeant seemed to shrink under the weight of it. "Because, Master Sergeant, some operations are so sensitive that even acknowledging they occurred could compromise national security. Sergeant Devane's assignment here was meant to be a transition posting, a chance to decompress after sustained combat operations. Instead, you and your fellow instructors decided she was not worth your time or respect." The colonel's words landed like physical blows. Rourke was staring at his boots, his face flushed with shame. Oakes looked like he wanted to apologize, but could not find the words. Lieutenant Cross sat rigid in his chair, his career effectively ended by his own arrogance and incompetence. Ashford turned back to Kira, his expression softening slightly. "Sergeant Devane, I apologize on behalf of this unit for the treatment you have endured. No soldier with your record should have been subjected to such ignorance." Kira's voice, when she spoke, was as quiet as ever. "No apology necessary, sir. I understood the situation when I accepted the assignment." The grace of her response only made the shame in the room more acute. She was not angry, not vindictive, not gloating. She simply was, with the same calm acceptance she had shown for 2 weeks while being relegated to the background. "Nevertheless," Ashford said firmly, "changes will be made. Effective immediately, you are the senior combat instructor for this unit. All advanced training programs fall under your authority. You will design the curriculum, select the assistant instructors, and establish new protocols. Do you have any questions?" "No, sir," Kira replied. "I can begin tomorrow." "You will begin today," Ashford corrected. "I want a preliminary training plan on my desk before I leave this evening, and I want these instructors to understand exactly what they have been missing." He gestured to the assembled group, many of whom were still processing the revelation. "Sergeant Devane will conduct a demonstration this afternoon. All instructors will attend. All recruits will attend. You will see firsthand what real combat proficiency looks like." The briefing was dismissed, and the instructors filed out in stunned silence. Kira remained behind with Colonel Ashford, who closed a classified folder and looked at her with something approaching paternal concern. "How are you really doing, Sergeant?" he asked, his formal tone softening. "For months is not a long time to decompress from the kind of operations you were running." Kira considered the question carefully. I'm managing, sir. The quiet has been helpful, even if the circumstances were less than ideal. Ashford nodded slowly. I read the full after-action reports. What you and your team accomplished in Kandahar province was extraordinary. 63 confirmed kills does not capture the full scope of what you did there. It was my job, sir, Kira said simply. It was more than that, and we both know it. Ashford replied. You saved lives. American lives. Allied lives. You disrupted networks that would have killed dozens, maybe hundreds more. He paused, studying her face. But that kind of work leaves marks. If you need resources, support, counseling, you only need to ask. I appreciate that, sir, Kira said. But I am ready to teach. Ready to pass on what I have learned. Ashford smiled slightly. The first genuine warmth he had shown since arriving. Then let's show these instructors what they have been too blind to see. Word of the revelation spread through the base like wildfire. By lunch, every recruit knew that the quiet Sergeant Devane was actually a decorated special operations soldier with a kill count that exceeded most infantry companies. Private Crane, who had suspected there was more to her story, felt vindicated but also humbled. He had sensed depth, but he had not imagined this. The demonstration was scheduled for 1,400 hours on the main training field. The entire unit assembled, instructors and recruits alike, forming a large semicircle around the demonstration area. Tables had been set up displaying various weapons systems, from standard-issue rifles to more specialized equipment that made several instructors exchange confused glances. Colonel Ashford stood at the center, waiting until every eye was focused forward. Today, he announced, Sergeant Devane will demonstrate combat proficiency standards that I expect all instructors in this unit to aspire to. Pay attention, take notes, and understand that what you are about to witness is the result of years of training, multiple deployments, and a level of dedication that most of you have never encountered. Kira stepped forward, wearing her standard combat uniform, her expression unchanged. She moved to the first table, where a disassembled rifle lay in pieces. Without a word, she began reassembling it, her hands moving with such fluid precision that the weapon seemed to build itself. 30 seconds later, she held a fully assembled and loaded rifle. She moved to the firing position, acquired 3 targets at varying distances, and fired. 3 shots, 3 center mass hits, so rapid they almost sounded like a single extended report. She moved to the next station, where a different weapon system waited. Then another. Each time, the same fluid competence, the same devastating accuracy. She transitioned between weapons with the ease of someone putting on familiar clothes. The instructors watched in complete silence, their earlier dismissiveness now replaced by something approaching awe. But it was the final demonstration that truly drove the point home. A combat scenario had been set up, simulating a close-quarters engagement with multiple hostiles. Kira entered the structure alone, moving through rooms with controlled aggression that spoke of countless real operations. The sound of simulated gunfire echoed from within, punctuated by the sharp commands she gave to imaginary team members. When she emerged 90 seconds later, every simulated hostile had been neutralized with the kind of precision that combat instructors spent entire careers trying to teach. The field was silent. Even the recruits, who had limited context for what they were witnessing, understood they had seen something exceptional. Kira returned to stand beside Colonel Ashford, her breathing barely elevated, her expression still calm. That, Ashford said to the assembled group, is your new standard. Questions? Nobody had questions. They were still processing what they had seen, still trying to reconcile the quiet woman who had stood on safety duty with a warrior who had just demonstrated combat proficiency that most of them would never achieve. Staff Sergeant Rourke stepped forward, his voice rough. Sergeant Devane, I owe you an apology. We all do. I was wrong about you. Completely wrong. Kira looked at him with those amber eyes that had seen things none of them could imagine. Apology accepted, Staff Sergeant. Now let's focus on making this unit better. The afternoon sun beat down on the training field as the demonstration concluded, But something fundamental had shifted in the Advanced Infantry Training Unit. The Quiet One was quiet no longer, not in the way they had understood it. Her silence was not weakness, but the calm of someone who had nothing left to prove. And now, finally, everyone could see it. The transformation of the Advanced Infantry Training Unit did not happen overnight, but it began that very afternoon. As the sun started its descent toward the horizon, Kira sat in what had been Lieutenant Cross's office, now temporarily hers, drafting the training plan that Colonel Ashford had requested. Her fingers moved across the keyboard with the same precision she had demonstrated on the firing range, translating years of combat experience into a structured curriculum. Cross himself had departed within an hour of the briefing, his face ashen as he carried a single box of personal effects to his vehicle. There had been no dramatic confrontation, no angry words, just the quiet end of a career derailed by arrogance and poor judgment. Kira had watched him leave from the office window, feeling neither satisfaction nor sympathy. It simply was. A knock at the door interrupted her work. Staff Sergeant Rourke stood in the doorway, his usual swagger completely absent. His shoulders were slightly hunched, and his eyes would not quite meet hers. "Sergeant Devane, may I have a moment?" he asked, his voice stripped of its former bombast. Kira gestured to the chair across from her desk. Rourke sat heavily, looking like a man carrying an uncomfortable weight. For several seconds, he said nothing, just stared at his hands clasped in his lap. "I have been in the Army for 17 years," he began finally. "I have deployed 3 times. I have trained hundreds of soldiers, and I have never felt as foolish as I did this afternoon." Kira remained silent, letting him continue. "I saw you, and I made assumptions based on nothing but my own prejudices," Rourke continued, his voice rough with emotion. "You were quiet, so I assumed you were weak. You were small, so I assumed you were ineffective. You were a woman, so I assumed you had not seen real combat. Every single assumption was wrong, and I let those assumptions guide how I treated you." He finally looked up, meeting her amber eyes directly. "I am sorry, Sergeant. Truly sorry. You deserve better from me, from all of us. And I want you to know that I am ready to learn from you, if you are willing to teach someone who has already proven himself to be an idiot." Kira considered his words carefully. When she spoke, her voice carried no anger, no resentment. "Staff Sergeant, you made assumptions based on incomplete information and cultural conditioning. That does not make you an idiot. It makes you human. What matters now is what you do with the complete information." Rourke nodded slowly, something like relief washing over his features. "What do you need from me?" "I need you to help me rebuild this unit's training program," Kira replied. "You have 17 years of experience. That experience has value, even if it was misdirected. I need instructors who understand that combat is not about who talks the loudest or looks the most intimidating. It is about competence, discipline, and the ability to make life or death decisions under pressure." "I can do that," Rourke said, sitting up straighter. "I want to do that." "Then we start tomorrow at 0500, Kira told him. "Bring Oaks and Voss. We're going to redesign the entire curriculum from the ground up." After Rourke left, others came. Sergeant First Class Oaks arrived with a 6-pack of energy drinks and a sheepish expression, offering to help with whatever she needed. Master Sergeant Voss appeared an hour later, still processing what he had witnessed, but clearly struggling to reconcile his ego with his newfound respect. Each of them, in their own way, was trying to bridge the gap between who they had thought she was and who she actually turned out to be. The recruits reacted differently. Private Crane knocked on her door near sunset, his young face bright with something approaching hero worship. "Sergeant Devane," he said, practically vibrating with energy. "That demonstration today was the most incredible thing I have ever seen. The way you moved, the way you handled those weapons, it was like watching someone who had been doing it their entire life." "I have been doing it for a significant portion of my life," Kira replied with the faintest hint of a smile. "Can you teach me?" Crane asked eagerly. I know you will be teaching all of us now, but can you show me specifically how to move like that? How to think like that?" Kira studied the young private, seeing in him a genuine hunger to learn that had nothing to do with ego or competition. It reminded her of herself at that age, hungry for knowledge, desperate to prove she belonged in a world that constantly questioned her presence. Combat movement is not something you learn in a day. Private, she said gently. It is the result of thousands of repetitions, hundreds of training hours, and, unfortunately, real experience under fire. But I can teach you the foundations. The rest will come with time and dedication. I have both, Crane said earnestly. Time and dedication. Whatever it takes. Then be at the training field tomorrow at 04:30, Kira told him, before the official training begins. Bring your running shoes and an open mind. Crane saluted with such enthusiasm that it was almost comical, then hurried away to prepare. Kira returned to her training plan, but found herself pausing to look out the window at the darkening base. The weight of responsibility she now carried was familiar, but still significant. These soldiers, both instructors and recruits, would be looking to her not just for technical knowledge, but for leadership. For proof that the quiet ones, the underestimated ones, the ones who did not fit the traditional warrior mold, could not only survive but excel. Colonel Ashford appeared in her doorway near 2000 hours, his tie loosened but his bearing still impeccable. He carried 2 cups of coffee and offered her one without asking. "How are you holding up?" he asked, settling into the chair Rourke had occupied hours earlier. Adjusting, Kira replied, accepting the coffee gratefully. "It is strange to have my service record exposed like this. I have spent years operating in the shadows. I imagine it is," Ashford agreed. But these soldiers needed to see the truth. They needed to understand that their assumptions about what a warrior looks like were dangerously narrow. He sipped his coffee, his eyes thoughtful. "I read about Operation Phantom Scythe in your classified file. The mission in Kandahar province where you spent 48 hours alone behind enemy lines after your extraction team was compromised. 27 hostile contacts eliminated with limited ammunition and no support. That was a difficult operation," Kira acknowledged quietly, the memory flickering behind her eyes like old film. "Difficult is an understatement," Ashford said. "Most soldiers would not have survived the first 12 hours. You turned it into one of the most successful direct action missions of the entire deployment." He paused, his expression serious. "You have nothing to prove to anyone, Sergeant. Not anymore. But what you can do is teach the next generation that effectiveness comes in many forms." "That is my intention, sir," Kira replied. Ashford stood, preparing to leave. "The training plan you submitted is excellent, by the way. Comprehensive, realistic, and properly focused on actual combat skills rather than performative displays. I approved it in full. You have my complete support." After he left, Kira remained at her desk, watching the base settle into its nighttime rhythm. Lights flickered on in barracks windows. Soldiers moved between buildings on various duties. The familiar sounds of military life continued around her, but something fundamental had shifted. Tomorrow, she would begin the real work of transforming this unit, of taking the raw material of soldiers and instructors and forging them into something more effective, more lethal, more prepared for the realities of modern combat. Her phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Chief Warrant Officer Vestra, the EOD specialist who had witnessed her disarm the training mine. The message was simple. "Heard about today. Always knew there was more to your story. Coffee sometime." Kira smiled slightly, the expression barely visible but genuine. She typed a response, "Tomorrow after training. I will take you up on that." The pieces were falling into place. The unit was being rebuilt, and the quiet warrior who had spent 2 weeks being underestimated was finally being seen for exactly what she was. The transformation began in darkness. At 04:30 the next morning, Private Crane stood on the training field wearing his running shoes and a mixture of excitement and nervousness on his young face. The base was still mostly asleep, just a few lights visible in the distant buildings, and the air held that peculiar quality of pre-dawn coolness that would burn away within hours. Kira emerged from the shadows wearing plain, physical training gear, her hair pulled back in its usual tight bun. She carried no clipboard, no training aids, just herself and the accumulated knowledge of 1,000 similar mornings in far more dangerous places. "Good morning, Private," she said quietly. "Ready to begin?" "Yes, Sergeant," Crane replied, standing at attention. At ease, Kira told him, "This is not about formality. This is about fundamentals. Everything I'm going to teach you starts with movement. Not running, not physical fitness, but movement. How you transition between positions, how you clear corners, how you minimize your profile while maintaining awareness. These are the building blocks of staying alive in combat." For the next 90 minutes, she put Crane through drills that looked deceptively simple but revealed layers of complexity with each repetition. Low crawls that emphasize balance and noise discipline. Transition drills from standing to prone that prioritize speed without sacrificing control. Corner clearing techniques that required him to process multiple angles simultaneously. Crane struggled, his young body strong, but unpracticed in these specific movements, and Kira corrected him with endless patience. "You are thinking too much," she observed as he fumbled a transition for the 5th time. "Your body knows what to do. Your mind is getting in the way. Combat does not give you time to think through every movement. You need muscle memory so deep that your body reacts before your conscious mind even registers the threat." "How do I do that?" Crane asked, breathing hard. "Repetition," Kira replied simply. "Thousands of repetitions until the movement becomes as natural as breathing. That is the price of competence." By the time the official training day began at 0600, Crane was exhausted but glowing with the satisfaction of hard work and genuine learning. Other recruits noticed the change in him, the new confidence in his movements, and word began to spread that Sergeant Devane was offering additional training to those willing to show up early. The official training sessions that followed were unlike anything the unit had experienced before. Kira restructured everything, stripping away the performative elements that had dominated the previous curriculum and replacing them with practical, realistic scenarios based on her actual combat experience. The instructors, including Rourke, Voss, and Oakes, found themselves learning alongside the recruits, their own assumptions about combat tactics challenged and refined. On the 3rd day of the new program, Kira introduced a scenario that made several instructors visibly uncomfortable. She had set up a room clearing exercise that emphasized decision-making under ambiguity, where some targets were clearly hostile but others were civilians in a combat zone. It was the kind of scenario that reflected real deployments, where the rules of engagement were complex and mistakes could have catastrophic consequences. Staff Sergeant Rourke went through first, his movements competent, but his decision-making too aggressive. He engaged 2 targets that Kira had deliberately marked as potential civilians, prioritizing speed over discrimination. When he emerged, Kira's feedback was direct but not cruel. "You just killed 2 non-combatants, Staff Sergeant. In a real operation, that would be an international incident and the end of your career. Speed is important, but not at the expense of judgment." Rourke absorbed the criticism with visible humility, a stark contrast to how he would have reacted 3 weeks earlier. "What should I have done differently?" Kira walked him back through the scenario, pointing out visual cues he had missed, explaining how split-second assessment required training your eye to process specific details even under stress. The other instructors watched and learned, their respect for her knowledge deepening with each demonstration. Master Sergeant Voss approached her during a break, his expression thoughtful. "Sergeant Devane, can I ask you something personal?" "You can ask," Kira replied, the same response she had given Private Crane. "When you were in those classified operations, how did you deal with the weight of it? The killing, the decisions, the constant pressure?" Kira was quiet for a moment, her amber eyes distant. "You focus on the mission," she said finally. "You remember that every hostile you eliminate is someone who cannot harm your teammates, cannot harm civilians, cannot continue spreading violence. You do not celebrate it, but you do not apologize for it either. It is the job, and if you are not prepared to do that job, you should not be in combat." Voss nodded slowly, processing her words. "I deployed twice," he said. "I thought I understood combat. But listening to you, watching you teach, I am realizing I only saw a fraction of what combat actually is. Most people only see a fraction, Kira replied. That is not a criticism. It is just reality. Different roles, different exposures, different experiences. By the end of the second week, under Kira's leadership, the unit's performance metrics had already begun to shift. Qualification pass rates increased. Injury rates decreased because the training was smarter, more focused on technique than raw physical stress. The recruits moved with more confidence and precision. The instructors taught with renewed purpose, their egos no longer the driving force behind their methods. Colonel Ashford returned for a follow-up inspection and spent an entire day observing the new training program. He watched Kira work with a group of struggling recruits, her quiet voice somehow carrying more authority than the shouting that had previously dominated the training field. He observed Staff Sergeant Rourke implementing the new close-quarters combat protocols with genuine enthusiasm. He saw Private Crane execute a room-clearing drill with the kind of controlled aggression that took most soldiers months to develop. That evening, Ashford sat with Kira in her office, reviewing the updated performance reports. "Remarkable," he said, genuine admiration in his voice. 2 weeks, and you have fundamentally changed this unit's culture and effectiveness. I am recommending you for a commendation." "That is not necessary, sir," Kira replied. "I'm just doing my job." That phrase again, Ashford observed with a slight smile. "Just doing your job. You have a remarkable talent for understatement, Sergeant." He leaned back in his chair, his expression becoming more serious. "I also want to discuss your future. A soldier with your skills and experience should not remain at this training unit indefinitely. There are opportunities, positions that could use someone with your particular expertise." Kira met his gaze steadily. "With respect, sir, I am not ready to return to operational assignments. Not yet. These soldiers need what I can teach them. And truthfully, I need this as much as they do." Ashford studied her face, seeing something in her eyes that spoke of deeper truths. "The decompression," he said quietly. "You are still processing everything from your last deployment." "Every deployment," Kira corrected softly. "Every operation, every decision. Teaching helps. It gives purpose to the experience, makes the sacrifices mean something beyond just mission completion." The colonel nodded, understanding. "Then you stay here as long as you need. Build this program. Train these soldiers. And when you are ready for the next chapter, let me know. The Army needs more leaders like you." After he left, Kira remained at her desk, but her mind was elsewhere. She thought about the 19-year-old version of herself, desperate to prove she belonged, working twice as hard for half the recognition. She thought about the operations that had earned her those classified commendations, the teammates she had lost, the enemies she had eliminated, the fine line between warrior and weapon. And she thought about Private Crane, showing up every morning before dawn, hungry to learn, representing a new generation that might do things better than hers had. Her phone buzzed with a message from Chief Warrant Officer Vestra, reminding her about their coffee meeting. Kira smiled slightly and typed a response confirming. New connections were forming, new relationships built on mutual respect rather than assumptions. The quiet warrior was no longer quite so alone, and the unit she was building would be stronger for it. 3 weeks into the new training regime, an unexpected challenge arrived that would test not just Kira's technical competence, but her ability to lead under scrutiny. Word of the dramatic transformation at the Advanced Infantry Training Unit had spread through division channels, and with it came skepticism from other commands who questioned whether one soldier, regardless of her record, could truly revolutionize training methods that had been standard for decades. The challenge manifested in the form of Command Sergeant Major Roland Blackwood, a 30-year veteran with a reputation for being uncompromising, traditional, and deeply suspicious of anything that deviated from established doctrine. He arrived unannounced at 0700 on a Wednesday morning, his uniform so heavily decorated with badges and tabs that it told a story of countless deployments and hard-won experience. Blackwood stood at the edge of the training field, his arms crossed, watching Kira conduct a complex multi-team exercise that involved coordinated movement, communication under stress, and split-second decision-making. His expression was carefully neutral, but the instructors who noticed his presence felt their anxiety spike. This was a man who could end careers with a single negative report. Kira saw him, but did not alter her teaching. She moved between teams, offering corrections and guidance in her characteristic quiet voice, her attention fully on the soldiers under her instruction. When the exercise concluded, she dismissed the recruits for a water break and approached Blackwood with measured steps. "Command Sergeant Major," she said, coming to attention. "Welcome to the Advanced Infantry Training Unit." Blackwood studied her with eyes that had evaluated thousands of soldiers over his long career. "At ease, Sergeant Devane. I have been hearing interesting things about what you are doing here. Some people are calling it revolutionary. Others are calling it reckless. Which camp do you fall into, Sergeant Major?" Kira asked directly. "I fall into the skeptical camp," Blackwood replied. "I have seen plenty of hotshots with impressive records think they can reinvent the wheel, only to discover that traditional methods exist for good reasons. So convince me. Show me why I should not recommend that Division return this unit to standard training protocols." Kira nodded once, accepting the challenge without defensiveness. "What would you like to see, Sergeant Major?" "Everything," Blackwood said flatly. "Your methods, your reasoning, your results. I will be here for 3 days. If you are as good as Colonel Ashford claims, you will not mind the scrutiny." "Not at all," Kira replied. "Welcome to observe anything you wish." For the next 3 days, Blackwood became a silent shadow across the training compound. He attended every session, watched every drill, interviewed instructors and recruits, and took copious notes in a worn leather notebook. His presence created tension among the instructors, who worried that their earlier failures would reflect poorly on the current program. But Kira remained unchanged, teaching with the same quiet intensity, making corrections with the same patient precision. On the second day, Blackwood asked to see the most challenging scenario in the curriculum. Kira led him to the combat decision-making course, the same one that had humbled Staff Sergeant Rourke weeks earlier. She explained the purpose and design, emphasizing how it forced soldiers to process complex information under pressure while maintaining ethical judgment. "Run it yourself," Blackwood ordered. "Show me how it should be done." Kira entered the course without hesitation. What followed was a demonstration of combat proficiency so refined that even Blackwood, with his 3 decades of experience, found himself impressed despite his determination to remain skeptical. She moved through the scenario with fluid efficiency, her weapon handling perfect, her decision-making instantaneous but accurate. Every hostile was engaged. Every civilian was protected. Every corner was cleared with textbook precision that somehow looked effortless. When she emerged, Blackwood was silent for a long moment. "Where did you train?" he asked finally. "Various places," Kira replied. "Some that appear in public records, some that do not." "I read your classified file," Blackwood said quietly. "Colonel Ashford granted me access. Operation Phantom Scythe, Operation Silent Thunder, Operation Copper Fawn. Your record reads like something from a movie, except movies do not include the kind of details I saw in those after-action reports." Kira met his gaze steadily. "Movies also do not include the cost, Sergeant Major. The teammates lost, the close calls, the decisions that haunt you years later. This training program is built on those costs. Every scenario, every drill, every correction comes from lessons learned the hard way." Blackwood nodded slowly, something shifting in his expression. That evening, he asked to speak with Staff Sergeant Rourke privately. The conversation lasted over an hour, and when Rourke emerged, he looked shaken but also somehow lighter, as if a burden had been acknowledged and shared. The next morning, Blackwood requested a meeting with Kira in her office. He sat across from her desk, his notebook open before him, pages filled with observations and assessments. "Sergeant Devane, I came here expecting to find an overconfident operator trying to impose her personal experience as universal truth," he began. "That is not what I found." He tapped his notebook with one thick finger. "What I found is a training program built on genuine expertise, tempered with humility, and focused on preparing soldiers for the reality of modern combat rather than the fantasy of it. Your instructors are not just following your methods, they're understanding the reasoning behind them. Your recruits are not just performing drills, they're developing actual combat judgment. Kira listened without interruption, her expression neutral. More importantly, Blackwood continued, "You have created a culture where admitting ignorance is acceptable, where asking questions is encouraged, where the quiet professional is valued as much as the loud performer. That is rare in military training environments, and it is desperately needed." He closed his notebook with finality. "I will be recommending to Division Command that your training methods be studied for potential implementation across multiple units. I will also be recommending you for promotion to Master Sergeant and assignment as the Division's Senior Combat Training Advisor." "That is not necessary," Kira said, the familiar phrase emerging automatically. "It is absolutely necessary," Blackwood countered firmly. "Soldiers with your knowledge and your ability to communicate that knowledge effectively are extremely rare. The Army cannot afford to keep you confined to one training unit when you could be shaping programs across the entire division." He stood, extending his hand. "It has been an honor to observe your work, Sergeant Devane. The Army needs more leaders like you. Leaders who understand that true strength does not need to announce itself." Kira shook his hand, feeling the weight of recognition from someone whose opinion carried significant influence throughout the military community. "Thank you, Sergeant Major. That means a great deal coming from someone with your experience." After Blackwood departed, word of his assessment spread quickly through the unit. The instructors felt vindicated, their faith in Kira's methods confirmed by one of the most respected senior enlisted leaders in the division. The recruits trained with renewed intensity, understanding that they were part of something significant, something that might change how the Army prepared soldiers for combat. Private Crane appeared at Kira's office door that evening, his face glowing with pride. "Sergeant Devane, I heard that the Command Sergeant Major recommended you for promotion and division-level assignment. That is incredible." Kira looked up from a training schedule she was reviewing. "It is an honor, Private, but the work here is not finished." "Will you leave?" Crane asked, unable to hide his concern. "Eventually," Kira replied honestly, "when the time is right. But not yet. This unit still needs attention, and honestly, I still need this work." Crane nodded, clearly relieved. "For what it is worth, Sergeant, you have changed my entire understanding of what it means to be a soldier. Before you arrived, I thought it was about being the loudest, the most aggressive, the most physically imposing. Now I understand it is about competence, judgment, and the quiet confidence that comes from genuine expertise." Kira smiled slightly, one of those rare expressions that softened her features. "That is exactly right, Private. Remember that, especially as you advance in your career, the best warriors are often the quietest ones." As night fell over Fort Bragg, Kira remained in her office, reflecting on the journey from being dismissed and underestimated to being recognized and respected. The transformation was not just in how others saw her, but in how she was learning to see herself beyond the classified operations and combat statistics. She was more than her kill count, more than her commendations, more than the warrior she had been forced to become. She was a teacher, a leader, and, perhaps most importantly, someone who was finally finding peace with all she had done and all she had lost. 6 weeks after Colonel Ashford's initial revelation, the Advanced Infantry Training Unit had become something entirely different from what it had been. The physical space remained the same, the buildings still aging and weathered, but the spirit of the place had transformed completely. Instructors moved with purpose rather than ego. Recruits trained with genuine focus rather than performative intensity. And at the center of it all was Kira, still quiet, still reserved but no longer invisible. The formal recognition ceremony was scheduled for a Friday morning, an event that would officially acknowledge the unit's transformation and Kira's role in creating it. Division leadership would be attending, including Major General Patricia Sandoval, the commanding officer who oversaw all training operations in the region. The ceremony represented not just individual recognition, but validation of a new approach to combat training that challenged decades of established practice. Kira stood in her quarters the morning of the ceremony, adjusting her dress uniform with hands that had assembled weapons in complete darkness and disarmed explosives under fire. The uniform felt constrictive after weeks of wearing combat fatigues, and the array of ribbons and badges on her chest told a story that most people would never fully understand. 2 silver stars, represented by simple ribbons that carried the weight of classified operations. 4 bronze stars with valor, each one marking a moment when she had acted with exceptional courage under fire. The Purple Heart, testament to bloodshed and service to missions that officially never happened. A knock at her door interrupted her reflection. Staff Sergeant Rourke stood outside, also in his dress uniform, looking uncomfortable in the formal attire. "Sergeant Devane," he said, his voice carrying a warmth that would have been unthinkable 2 months earlier. "I wanted to thank you before the ceremony. For everything. For being patient with us, for not holding our ignorance against us, for teaching us what real leadership looks like." Kira studied him for a moment, seeing genuine transformation in a man who had once dismissed her without thought. "You did the hard work, Staff Sergeant. I just provided the framework. The changes you have made, the instructor you have become, that came from your willingness to admit you did not know everything and your dedication to becoming better." Rourke nodded, emotion flickering across his weathered face. "My daughter is about your age," he said quietly. "She is in college, studying engineering. When I told her about you, about what happened here, she said something that hit me hard. She said that I probably made assumptions about you the same way people make assumptions about her capabilities because she is a woman. And she was right. I am sorry it took me so long to see you for who you actually are." The apology carried depth that went beyond their professional relationship, touching on larger issues of bias and recognition. Kira felt the weight of it, understanding that this was about more than just one training unit or one underestimated soldier. "We are all learning," she replied gently. "That is what matters. Growth, not perfection." The ceremony took place on the main parade ground, with the entire training unit assembled in formation. Recruits stood at attention, their uniforms crisp, their bearing reflecting the discipline and confidence that 6 weeks of proper training had instilled. Instructors formed their own ranks, a mix of enlisted and officers who had all undergone their own transformations under Kira's guidance. Major General Sandoval stood at the podium, her 3 stars gleaming in the morning sun. She was a formidable woman in her early 50s, with a reputation for demanding excellence and having little patience for mediocrity. Her presence alone commanded attention, but it was her words that would carry lasting impact. "When I first received reports about the situation at this training unit," Sandoval began, her voice carrying across the assembled formation, "I was prepared to implement disciplinary measures and conduct a complete leadership overhaul. The metrics were unacceptable. The culture was toxic. The results were failing our soldiers and compromising our readiness." She paused, her gaze sweeping across the formation. "What I found instead, thanks to Colonel Ashford's thorough investigation, was an opportunity. An opportunity to learn from someone whose expertise had been criminally underutilized due to assumptions, biases, and a failure of leadership to look beyond surface appearances." Sandoval gestured for Kira to step forward. Kira moved with her characteristic quiet grace, taking position before the general and coming to attention with military precision. "Sergeant First Class Kira Devane," Sandoval continued, her voice filled with genuine respect, "represents everything we should value in a soldier and leader. Her combat record is exemplary and largely classified, but what I can tell you is that she has served with distinction in some of the most dangerous operations our military has conducted. She has demonstrated courage, competence, and dedication that few soldiers ever achieve." The general held up a certificate and a small case containing a new rank insignia. "But more importantly for this moment, she has demonstrated the ability to transform failure into excellence, to lead through example rather than volume, and to teach with patience and expertise that has revolutionized this unit's effectiveness. In 6 weeks, this unit has gone from the bottom quartile of division training performance to the top 10%. Qualification rates have increased by 37%. Injury rates have decreased by 52%. And perhaps most significantly, soldier satisfaction and confidence scores have increased by 68%. Sandoval pinned the Master Sergeant rank insignia on Kira's collar, the promotion officially recognizing not just her technical expertise, but her leadership capabilities. The assembled soldiers erupted in applause, a sound that echoed across the parade ground with genuine enthusiasm rather than obligatory recognition. Master Sergeant Devane, Sandoval said, her voice dropping slightly so only Kira could hear, "You have done something remarkable here, and now I need you to do it across the entire division. Your new assignment, effective immediately, is Division Senior Combat Training Advisor. You will work directly with my office to implement your training methodologies across all units under my command." This is not a request. Kira met the general's eyes, seeing both order and opportunity. "Understood, ma'am. I am ready." The general stepped back and addressed the formation once more. "Let this unit serve as an example to the entire division. Excellence is not about conforming to stereotypes or assumptions. It is about recognizing and utilizing the capabilities of every soldier, regardless of whether they fit our preconceived notions of what a warrior should look like." After the ceremony, soldiers approached Kira in waves, offering congratulations and thanks. Private Crane stood among them, his young face beaming with pride that was part personal achievement and part reflected glory from his mentor's recognition. "Master Sergeant Devane," he said, emphasizing her new rank with obvious pleasure. "Does this mean you will be leaving us?" "In a few weeks," Kira confirmed. "But you'll be fine, Private. You have learned the fundamentals. Now you just need to continue practicing, continue growing, continue questioning assumptions." "Will you still do the morning training sessions?" Crane asked hopefully. "Until I leave," Kira promised. Every morning at 04:30. As the crowd dispersed, Kira found herself standing alone on the parade ground for a moment, looking across the training field where she had been dismissed, where she had been underestimated, and where she had ultimately proven that quiet competence could transform an entire culture. The weight of her new responsibilities was significant, but so was the opportunity to influence how the Army prepared its soldiers for the realities of modern combat. Staff Sergeant Rourke approached one final time, Master Sergeant Voss and Sergeant First Class Oakes flanking him. The three men who had once mocked her now stood before her with expressions of genuine respect and gratitude. "We just wanted you to know," Rourke said, speaking for all of them, "that working under your leadership has been the most valuable professional experience of our careers. You taught us not just about combat tactics, but about humility, about recognizing our own limitations, and about the difference between confidence and arrogance. You also taught us," Voss added quietly, "that the most dangerous people in the world are often the ones who never need to tell you how dangerous they are." Kira smiled, that rare expression that transformed her face. "Keep that lesson close," she told them, "and teach it to the next generation. That is how we build a better army." The sun climbed higher over Fort Bragg as the ceremony concluded and normal operations resumed. But nothing was truly normal anymore, and everyone knew it. The Quiet One had changed everything, not through force or volume, but through the undeniable power of genuine expertise combined with patient leadership. And now that transformation would spread beyond one unit, beyond one base, influencing how an entire division prepared its warriors for the challenges ahead. The final morning training session came 3 weeks after the ceremony, as dawn broke over Fort Bragg with the kind of golden light that made everything seem momentarily perfect. Private Crane stood on the training field at 04:30, but he was not alone. 15 other recruits had joined him, word having spread about these special sessions that the now Master Sergeant Devane conducted before official training began. They stood in loose formation, waiting, their breath visible in the cool air. Kira emerged from the pre-dawn shadows, taking in the expanded group with approval. She had started with one eager private and was leaving with a small platoon of soldiers who understood that excellence required dedication beyond mandatory requirements. "Good morning," she said quietly, her voice carrying in the stillness. "This is our last session together. Tomorrow I transfer to division headquarters to begin my new assignment. So today, we are going to do something different." The recruits exchanged curious glances. Over the past 3 weeks, they had learned that when Sergeant Devane said something would be different, it meant they were about to learn something profound. Combat is not just about physical skills or tactical knowledge, Kira began, walking slowly along the line of soldiers. It is about understanding yourself, your limits, your fears, your strengths, and your capacity for growth. Every technique I have taught you, every drill we have practiced, all of it is built on that foundation of self-knowledge. She stopped, turning to face them directly. Some of you will deploy. Some of you will see combat. Some of you will face situations where your training is all that stands between you and failure, between life and death. And in those moments, you will not have time to doubt yourselves or question whether you belong. Private Crane felt the weight of her words, understanding that she was speaking from experience that most of them could barely imagine. "When I first arrived at this unit," Kira continued, her amber eyes reflecting the growing light, "I was underestimated, dismissed, mocked, not because of anything I did or failed to do, but because of assumptions people made based on how I looked, how I spoke, how I carried myself. Those assumptions were wrong, but I could not make people see the truth just by telling them. I had to show them through consistent competence and patient expertise." She paused, letting the lesson sink in. Each of you will face similar challenges in your careers. People will underestimate you for various reasons. Your age, your background, your appearance, your gender, your quiet nature. What matters is not their initial assessment, but your response to it. Do not waste energy being angry or defensive. Simply be excellent at what you do, and eventually, the truth will be undeniable. The recruits listened with absolute attention, understanding they were receiving wisdom that transcended standard military training. Master Sergeant Voss approached from the direction of the barracks, carrying a small wooden box. He had specifically asked to be present for this final session, wanting to witness the conclusion of something that had transformed his own understanding of leadership. Kira opened the box, revealing 15 challenge coins that she had personally commissioned. Each coin bore the unit insignia on one side and a simple phrase on the other, "Quiet competence." She moved down the line, presenting each recruit with their coin and a few words of personal encouragement tailored to what she had observed about their individual growth. When she reached Crane, she held his coin for an extra moment. "Private Crane, you are the first to recognize that there might be more beneath the surface. That curiosity and openness to learning will serve you well throughout your career. Never lose it." "I will not, Master Sergeant," Crane replied, his voice tight with emotion. "Thank you for everything." The morning training concluded with a final drill, all 15 recruits moving through a complex tactical scenario that synthesized everything they had learned in these pre-dawn sessions. Kira watched with satisfaction as they executed the movements with precision and confidence, their growth evident in every action. As the official training day began and the recruits dispersed to their regular duties, Staff Sergeant Rourke joined Kira and Voss on the training field. The three of them stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the base come fully to life around them. "We're going to miss you," Rourke said finally. "This unit will not be the same without you." "This unit will be fine," Kira replied confidently. "You have learned the methods. More importantly, you have learned the philosophy behind them. Just keep teaching with humility and focusing on genuine effectiveness rather than performance." Voss cleared his throat, clearly struggling with emotion he was not accustomed to displaying. "You know, Master Sergeant, when I first saw you, I thought you were the least impressive soldier I had ever met. Now I realize you are probably the most impressive soldier I will ever meet. That is a hell of a journey to take someone on in just a few weeks." Kira smiled slightly. "The journey was yours, Master Sergeant. I just provided some guidance." The final day passed in a blur of administrative tasks, farewell conversations, and final preparations for her new assignment. Colonel Ashford arrived in the afternoon to personally escort her to division headquarters, his presence a reminder of how this entire transformation had begun with his willingness to look beyond surface assessments. As Kira loaded her gear into the vehicle, nearly the entire unit assembled spontaneously to see her off. Instructors and recruits alike stood in informal formation, their respect and gratitude visible in their faces and postures. It was not a mandatory formation or an official ceremony, just an organic expression of what she had meant to them. Private Crane stepped forward, speaking for the group. "Master Sergeant Devane, we just wanted to say thank you for seeing potential in us that we did not see in ourselves, for teaching us that real strength does not need to announce itself, for showing us what true leadership looks like." Kira looked across the assembled faces, seeing the transformation that had occurred, not just in training metrics, but in hearts and minds. "You are welcome," she said simply. "But remember, the work does not end here. Every day, you have the opportunity to be excellent, to challenge assumptions, to lead with quiet competence. That is the real lesson. That is what matters." As the vehicle pulled away from the Advanced Infantry Training Unit, Kira watched through the window as the soldiers remained standing, watching her departure. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, from those early days of dismissal and mockery to this moment of recognition and respect. But more than that, she thought about what lay ahead, about the opportunity to spread these lessons across an entire division, to influence how thousands of soldiers would be trained and prepared for the challenges of modern warfare. The quiet warrior was no longer confined to one unit, no longer invisible or underestimated. Her voice, though still soft, would now carry across a much larger stage. And the lessons she had learned through years of classified operations, through survival against impossible odds, through the quiet cultivation of expertise in the shadows, those lessons would shape the next generation of warriors. If you enjoyed this story and it resonated with you, drop a comment and let us know what moment stood out most. Was it the initial revelation, the transformation of the instructors, or Kira's quiet leadership style? Maybe you know someone in your own life who embodies this kind of quiet competence, someone whose true capabilities were hidden beneath a reserved exterior. We would love to hear your thoughts and experiences. The sun climbed higher over Fort Bragg as Master Sergeant Kira Devane began the next chapter of her journey, carrying with her the knowledge that true strength did not require volume, that expertise spoke louder than bravado, and that the most dangerous warriors were often the quietest ones. The lesson had been learned, the transformation completed, and now it would spread, one unit at a time, one soldier at a time, changing how the Army understood and valued the warriors in its ranks. The incident with the training mine had created ripples that Kira had not anticipated. While most of the instructors remained skeptical, viewing her actions as either luck or a one-time demonstration of limited knowledge, a few began watching her more carefully. Sergeant First Class Oaks found himself noticing small details that he had missed before, the way she moved with economy of motion, the way her eyes constantly scanned her environment, the way she positioned herself in any room to maintain maximum situational awareness. During a classroom session on combat medicine, Kira sat in the back row, as usual, taking notes while Staff Sergeant Rourke lectured on basic trauma care. His instruction was adequate but outdated, focused on techniques that had been standard a decade earlier but had since been refined by lessons learned in actual combat zones. Kira remained silent, her pen moving across her notebook, until Rourke made a statement about tourniquet application that was dangerously incorrect. "Staff Sergeant," she said quietly, her voice barely audible over the ambient noise. "That technique was revised in the current combat casualty care guidelines. The high and tight application you described can cause unnecessary tissue damage. Current protocol recommends 2 to 3 inches above the wound." The room went silent. Rourke turned slowly, his face flushing. "And where exactly did you learn about current combat casualty care protocols, Devane? From a PowerPoint presentation? From applying 17 tourniquets in actual combat situations?" Kira replied evenly. 12 of those casualties survived to full recovery. The technique matters. The specificity of her response landed, like a physical blow. 17 tourniquets meant 17 serious injuries witnessed, 17 moments of life-threatening trauma managed under fire. It was a number that told a story of sustained combat exposure that contradicted everything the instructors believed about her. Rourke recovered quickly, his ego wounded, but his position as instructor forcing him to maintain authority. "We will follow the approved training manual, Sergeant Devane. If you have concerns about curriculum, take them up through proper channels." "Yes, Staff Sergeant," Kira said, returning to her notes without further comment. But several of the recruits were looking at her differently now, adding this moment to the growing collection of inconsistencies between who she was supposed to be and who she might actually be. That afternoon, during hand-to-hand combat training, Master Sergeant Voss was demonstrating defensive techniques against knife attacks. His instruction was competent but theoretical, the kind of teaching done by someone who had trained extensively but never actually faced a blade in genuine combat. He called for a volunteer to serve as the attacker for his demonstration. "Devane," he called out, a slight smirk on his face. "Come up here and try to stab me. Let's see if you can manage that." It was meant to be humiliating, a way to put her in a subordinate position while he demonstrated his superior skills. Kira stood and moved to the front of the group, accepting the rubber training knife that Voss handed her. The recruits watched with interest, sensing tension but not understanding its source. "Come at me like you mean it," Voss instructed, settling into his fighting stance. "Do not hold back just because you're worried about hurting me." Kira's expression did not change. She simply moved. What happened next occurred so quickly that most of the watching recruits could not fully process it. She feinted high, drawing Voss's defensive reaction, then dropped low and swept his legs while simultaneously redirecting his balance with a hand against his shoulder. Voss hit the ground hard, the air leaving his lungs in a rush, and before he could react, Kira had the training knife pressed against his carotid artery with her knee on his chest. The entire sequence had taken less than 3 seconds. She held the position for a moment, then stood smoothly and offered Voss her hand to help him up. He took it automatically, too shocked to refuse, and rose to his feet with his face burning red with embarrassment and anger. "Lucky shot," he muttered, trying to salvage his dignity. "Let's try that again." They went again. The result was identical, though Kira used a different technique. And again, and again. 4 times, Voss ended up on the ground with a training knife at his throat, and each time the movement was so controlled and precise that it became impossible to dismiss as luck. The recruits watched in stunned silence as their seemingly invincible instructor was systematically dismantled by the quiet woman they had all dismissed. Voss finally held up his hand, breathing hard, his ego thoroughly bruised. "All right, that is enough demonstration for today," he said curtly. "Clearly Sergeant Devane has some hand-to-hand experience. Break into pairs and practice the basic techniques I showed you earlier." As the recruits dispersed, Voss pulled Kira aside, his voice low and tight. "Where did you learn to fight like that? That was not basic combatives training." "Here and there," Kira replied, offering nothing more. "That is not an answer," Voss pressed. "You just humiliated me in front of my students. I deserve to know who I am dealing with." Kira met his gaze steadily. "With respect, Master Sergeant, you asked me to attack you like I meant it. I did what you requested. If that was humiliating, perhaps the lesson is to be more careful about what you request." She walked away before he could respond, leaving Voss standing alone with questions multiplying in his mind. The other instructors had witnessed the exchange, and later that evening in the barracks, the conversation inevitably turned to the growing mystery of Sergeant First Class Kira Devane. "Something does not add up," Oak said, sitting on his bunk and cleaning his pistol with methodical attention. "The ordnance knowledge, the combat medicine specifics, those hand-to-hand skills. That is not the profile of someone who spent their career in support units." "Maybe her file is incomplete," suggested another instructor, a younger sergeant named Felipe Torres. "Maybe there is more to her record that we do not have access to. Or maybe she is exaggerating," Voss countered, though his voice lacked conviction. "Anyone can get lucky in a training scenario. Real combat is different. But even as he said it, he remembered the controlled precision of her movements, the way she had read and countered his defenses with the kind of expertise that only came from extensive training and actual application. That was not luck. That was skill honed through repetition and pressure. Kira lay on her bunk on the far side of the barracks, reading her paperback novel and listening to their speculation with detached interest. She knew what was happening. The mask was slipping, not because she wanted it to, but because maintaining it while also doing her job was becoming impossible. Every time she corrected unsafe practices or demonstrated actual competence, she revealed another piece of the truth that her classified service record concealed. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Colonel Ashford, who was scheduled to arrive for his inspection in less than a week. The message was brief. Looking forward to seeing how the unit is functioning. I suspect there will be some interesting discoveries. Kira smiled slightly at the understatement. Ashford had access to her full file, knew exactly what was about to unfold, and was clearly looking forward to the revelation. She typed a simple response, "Yes, sir." It should be educational. As the barracks lights were dimmed for the night, Kira thought about the week ahead. The truth would come out, one way or another. The quiet warrior would be forced into the light, and everything would change. Part of her dreaded the attention, the questions, the inevitable transformation of how people treated her. But another part, the part that had spent years operating in shadows and carrying secrets, felt a strange sense of relief. Soon, she would no longer have to hide who she was or what she had done. The mask would fall, and for better or worse, everyone would finally see the truth.